It is TAW Unwrapped. I am Josh Sexton. We are back for the second episode of this. If you missed last week's episode, it was more of an emergency one. We were discussing the big talking point from the Liverpool world at the time, which was the Federico Chiesa song. I recommend that after you've watched this one, you go back and watch that one and look forward to the discourse that always follows that conversation around. I'm hoping there'll be less discourse about this one, and that really the next thing we'll see is Alexander Isak come to Liverpool. But to get stuck into the player power struggle, as I'm calling it, with me today, I have Stu Wright, Emilia, Bona and Andy Bell. We're going to sort of split this into three parts, because I think there are sort of three parties that are worth considering when we talk about player power, which is of course the player side of things, the role of the clubs involved, and then finally how it impacts us as fans. This is of course topical because we saw how Newcastle fans reacted to the arrival of Liverpool last night off the back of the Alexander Isak saga, which still rumbles on. 6 days left in the window. It'll be interesting to see what happens next with that. But Stu, it's not been the only example of this summer, because we've seen that, you know, Jacob Ramsey moved to Newcastle, and there was a few Villa players who came out in support of him. There's been Sam Morsey from Ipswich as well, who came out in support of Amari Hutchinson before his move to Nottingham Forest. And it's quite interesting really, because I think there's a couple of different conversations that run through this. We'll sort of park Isak for a moment and look at the Jacob Ramsey one specifically, because what it seemed to me from the players' reaction to that is that a lot of these conversations now around when local lads move on is that it's almost becoming a bit of a shame from the players' side of things, because they like seeing the local lads come through as much as us fans do, and especially when they're ones who seem like they are so local to the club in the way that Jacob Ramsey was with Aston Villa. But ultimately Aston Villa have PSR regulations to meet, and selling a player like Jacob Ramsey means it's pure profit.
Yeah, I think I realised a few years ago that, sadly, it burst my bubble a little bit, the romanticism around football, that, you know, whether we're talking about players or whether we're talking about boards of directors or owners, football is a completely different entity to them. You know, we call players, but actually, you know what, from the moment they sign a contract at 16, 17, 18, they're employees. Yeah, okay, they're employed as a player, but they are employees with their own personal agency over the career that they want to have. And as much as there might be some romance in that, if they've signed a contract with a boyhood club, ultimately at the end of the day, if that boyhood club isn't meeting their needs or isn't able to fulfil their career goals, then it's a different mindset than what we have, because their careers are so short. And for owners and football clubs broadly, they're not just employees, they've just become commodities that they can you know, buy and sell, they can trade. And we talk now, I think there's a lot of misplaced talk around player power. But actually, players really, in the big grand scheme of things, compared to other employees, you know, in general employment law, have so little power. They are treated, as I said there, as commodities that you know, bend to the will of the football club that they're serving at any given time. So and we see all the time, history is littered with football clubs who have promised X, Y and Z to a player, and then a season or two down the line get tired of them, get bored of them, decide they don't want them because the manager's changed or whatever, and then does whatever they can to get them out the club, and see them as completely expendable commodities. Perishable. The perishable goods, aren't they? Because there's always a turnover of them. You know, nothing is forever, no contract is forever. So I think, you know, our sense of loyalty as fans, as romantic as it is, in reality it's probably somewhat misplaced in what is the reality of football.
Absolutely, yeah. There's some interesting points that Stu makes within that, Emilia, because there's this Isak statement that's come out where he's accused Newcastle of broken promises, and I've always felt like the clubs hold the ultimate power here. It's referenced in the John McGinn statement, it's referenced in the Sam Morsey statement as well, that, you know, this is all part of the business. And Sam Morsey goes deeper into that, saying, you know, as Stu says there, that if the club didn't want a player, they would cast them out. They do everything they can to get them sold. You've seen it, you know, there was a picture that Axel Disasi from Chelsea put up the other day, which everyone's now referring to as the bomb squad at Chelsea, which is basically all the players that Chelsea don't want, and it seems like they've got their own little dressing room, and even that's like, it's such a dystopian idea of these footballers as commodities, that it sort of makes you respect the player power side more, almost, if a player like Isak is sort of, you know, taking his power back and being like, well, you made me a promise and you're not keeping it, so I'm not playing until you keep your promise. I can kind of understand that to an extent. If I completely remove myself as a fan and almost try to look at it as a neutral, well, I can completely understand, because if it was the other way around, Newcastle would have had him gone in a heartbeat.
100%. I think it's a really hard lesson to learn as an employee, whether that be like in the roles that we work in or in this kind of job, that fundamentally you don't matter to the person that you work for. In terms of like in a football context, you can deliver incredible results, you can make memories for us as fans that'll last a lifetime, be part of these really like central moments in our lives. But if the next day they want to shift you, you don't matter to them. And it's the same as working for kind of any large company in which you think like you give so much of yourself physically, mentally to a role, but actually you are a number and you're someone that you're completely expendable. And I think that's a lesson you probably have to learn a lot quicker as a footballer. It's something that it might take a lot of us like a decade into our career to work out. Whereas when you've got a shelf life in which you get to achieve kind of whatever you can and you do have to be selfish, it's probably a lesson you've got to learn really early on. And I think that the statements that are either put out by Isak, by the players that you've mentioned, or by teammates defending them are really interesting just from like a HR point of view. It just looks terrible for everyone where you think like this, whatever your emotional investment is in each of those stories, it's been managed really badly if it has to end with someone putting out a statement on Instagram or on X to talk about their side of how this has gone. It just goes to show that it hasn't been managed properly. People's feelings haven't been managed properly. The business side of it hasn't been managed properly. And I think that's why the Isak one, I don't know, it just endeared me to him even more in being like, listen, you don't get to tell this story.
I was going to ask that because it seems to me like the question so far has been almost framed as like, you know, are you worried that Isak's going to be a problem if he does come to Liverpool? Is there any of those sort of concerns attached to it? And for me, it more just made me understand the players' side more really, because you've had Alan Shearer coming out and slagging him off. You know, basically every sort of ex-player in the mainstream media, and then you see him come out and say, well, no, they've broken promises. So in that sense, I did feel a little bit sorry for him.
100%. And then I think if I'm trying to be a bit more like self-critical about it, I think that my bias means that I completely agree with all of this until it comes to Trent Alexander-Arnold or one of our, like if it's a homegrown lad who plays for us, I feel completely differently to how I'd feel if I'm talking about a homegrown talent that's left another club. And I think it comes down to what weight you put into loyalty and how you see the term selfishness. Because I think like being selfish doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's something that's overwhelmingly seen as being selfish. But if it's like self-preservation, self-advancement, not kind of at the expense of everybody else, but your career as a footballer, like you said, it's their job. The club doesn't mean to them what it means to us. They don't have the same associations with it. They're just doing what's right for them and their family, where they want to live, the money that they want to earn, how they want their career to advance. It's okay to be selfish when it comes to your career as a player. But then I completely changed my mind on that when it's about our club and it's how I feel about it being your boyhood club. You haven't come through the academy system. I think it's really, really hard to take your own emotions out of it.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's why a couple of the Villa players have sort of raced to defend Jacob Ramsey, really, because there is that sort of local element attached to it. I'm interested, Andy, in the sort of, you know, how sentiment changes over time, because I think there's been a bit of discussion, particularly around Isak as well, about how he can bleed himself back into the Newcastle team if he does stay at the club. You know, Eddie Howe's sort of tried to leave that door open for him, but we've seen teammates who've maybe, you know, almost cast, like, thrown a bit of shade in the media to him so far, but they're still trying to manage that PR that they will be able to let him back in. I mean, we've been through a couple of these scenarios. You think of the Suarez one, where he tries to leave to Arsenal in the summer and he comes in and has his best season at the club and then gets his sort of dream move the season after that. And you can almost think about, you know, from our fan side of things, the Torres situation when he leaves and comes and explains his side of the story a few years later, and you know, our stance is all softened on it then, because we're looking at it sort of almost defending the player, being like, listen, Liverpool were terribly run at the time. It seems that Torres was made a couple of promises that weren't kept, and it seems like the club was just in complete shambles, and that was sort of why he had to leave, really. So I just wonder if we almost need to hear the players' side of things more and earlier in these scenarios. Like, is it good now that we've finally heard what Isak has to say on this before the narrative went completely for a walk?
Well, I think the interesting thing is here that in a lot of these sagas that you mentioned, certainly the Isak one, how you paint the player is a big part of the sort of reputation of these big business giants, or in the case of Newcastle, geopolitical giants. And we've seen a lot of the time it becomes all about ego. It becomes all about how you sort of stage manage a situation and show that you did your best to keep him. And the way that Newcastle have done that, and in fairness, Alexander Isak seems to have been happy enough to go along with it just to get his move, but is to really paint him as the bad guy. So, you know, you're looking right now, and Newcastle are looking at obviously Strand Larsson. They're looking at trying to bring in Vissa. Alexander Isak has gone on strike. That was his decision. That wasn't the club's decision. But then there was another article which came out and said that actually, even if he's still there after the end of the transfer window, he's still going to stay on strike. Now, from a club's point of view, that's absolutely perfect because you're able to get the money in for the player that probably there's certain people around the club do want out, Eddie Howe definitely being one. Get your replacements in and say to your supporters, look, he said he was never going to play for us again. What were we meant to do? You get 30 million less from him in 6 months. He's not played for us at all. He's painted himself as a bad guy. Now, Alexander Isak's been happy to do that, but in a lot of cases, you look at, for example, like the case of Marcus Rashford. I know it's not a PSR question, but he is constantly painted out to be the bad guy. Very rarely gets his opportunity to give his side of the story. Probably for legal reasons as much as anything else. These players are probably wrapped up in legal,
NDAs and all sorts.
NDAs where they can't come out and give their side of the story because they're slagging this person off and this person off and this person really, really high up who's the best lawyers in the world and will take you to the cleaners. So players' hands are tied, I think, a lot of the time in terms of giving their own stories, and a lot of these big names and big egos and big businessmen can pretty much paint players how they want just to get a little bit of goodwill from the supporters ultimately.
I think that's why the statements are always really interesting, be it from the players or from their teammates, because it's never direct, like it never really does lay out, here's what happened on this timeline and these are the facts of it, because you probably can't. It's more of a no one will ever know the full story. I know that promises were made and this didn't happen, or like there are two sides to it type thing. It's like I don't know, like a Facebook ma, like after a breakup being like, there's two sides to every story.
Yeah,
Just
just be the kids.
but like it's very like inbox me hun, you're not gonna get like the full thing. But as much as possible, like some players do want to try and take back a narrative if they're going, I've been made to look like a baddie here and I'm not a baddie, and it must be a really difficult position to be in if your hands are totally tied and you can't say anything.
I think it's changed a lot over the last sort of 5-6 years in the era of PSR. I'm not sure how important it was how transfers were put down in the books prior to all of this. Probably not that important really, but you've got players on mad contracts now purely to spread the transfer fee over a certain period of time. So surely there's a conversation when players join a club. They say, right, yeah, no worries, I'll sign a 6-year contract so you can cook the books like this. But for the record, after 3 years, if you're not matching my ambitions, I need to be able to move on. So that's why I think a lot of the discourse around, Alexander Isak signed a 6-year contract, so it's all on him, blah blah blah. I'd be really surprised if there wasn't a conversation where I'd be really surprised if he signed a 6-year deal with Newcastle to take him up until, what's he now, 26 or 29? Yeah. Knowing that they could quite possibly just keep him there until that point, in the peak of his career, if he backed himself to be the striker he is now. So that's where I'd say the sort of broken promises are. Contracts aren't necessarily what they were 15, 20 years ago, I'd imagine.
Time's a great healer, isn't it? I have to say, and I do think that over time, a lot of the entrenched views from fans towards players who feel that they have a very, very specific reason for wanting to get out of a club. We can be quite toxic towards them at times. We can feel like they've broken our hearts. I never got over Torres. I think that's probably the point where I started to change my views. But time has shown that we've softened in our opinions. And, a bit came out, didn't it, then, from Torres' side a few years later. He got to speak his truth around it. And, this club was at a time where it was still trying to get over the aftermath of the Hicks and Gillette saga. I know he left under FSG, but many of the top players had gone by that point. And so I think history changes people's views over these sagas. And, I don't want to say too much on this for obvious reasons, but I don't think history is going to be kind when it looks back on this era of Newcastle's ownership. I don't think that this is going to be a period of time that anyone is celebrating in the grander landscape of football. We know what it is, and it's not the only club that is going through this or associated with this. So I think Isak, no one should feel too sorry for him. He's a footballer on a lot of money who gets to do a job that he loves to do, but he has the right to have some agency over his career. He should do. Everyone in every walk of life should have the right to have some level of agency there. You just cannot be locked down to any job and told you must perform now.
It's not national service.
It's absolutely not. Yeah. And if you're a football club and if you're a fan, as much as that breaks your heart, as much as you're saddened by that, for me, once a player says you don't want to play for Liverpool, go.
Yeah.
The club then have got to facilitate that person's exit. And hopefully on the best possible terms for Liverpool, but ultimately, I want them gone. There's just no point in sticking around like a bad smell because it's affecting everybody else. It's not doing the club any favours, and that's life. And I think football, fans, but the football industry needs to really catch up legally around this and what employment law is. I think there needs to be some significant changes long term to protect the agency that players as human beings have over the short careers that they've got ahead of them.
Do you think the Suarez thing is a bit of a counterpoint to that, Stu? Because my big issue with the Suarez thing at the time was the idea of him going to a rival, and I sort of had a lot of sympathy for Liverpool in that sense. And listen, it's easy for me to have sympathy for the football club I support and not necessarily side with the player on things, because as you say, once the player says he wants to leave, I'm happy to see him gone, but I also don't want to strengthen a rival. And Suarez stays, doesn't get that Arsenal move, and then has the best year of his career, and I almost immediately go back to celebrating the footballer and what he brought to Liverpool that season. So do you think that's a bit of a counterpoint?
Yeah, but I think you can always find exceptions that disprove the rule, if you like.
Yeah.
And I think that the reason that those exceptions exist is because of the landscape, employment-wise, that is within football institutionally now. So you've got a situation like Isak, you had a situation like Suarez, then you've got a situation like that, where they're having to fight their way out. They're having to down tools, they're having to take these steps. And some clubs, just by hook or by look, just by sheer luck or circumstance, will be worse off, will come off worse off in a particular season or a particular few years than other clubs. Typically, it'll be lower down the food chain because the players are wanting to go to clubs higher up. But actually, if the employment law is different around it, then everyone's got to cop for it. It kind of evens things out. We saw that with the Bosman. Everyone has to cop for that, and everyone has to mitigate their contractual obligations as a club around that and change their model to accept that players do have greater agency. And until something like that happens, you're always going to have players, and I think it'll become even more frequent now, but players trying to take the power back in the only way that they can, by downing tools. And that's not great for anyone. No. It's not great for anyone. It's not certainly in this situation with Isak, it's not great for Newcastle. No. Because he's potentially going to be disvalued. It's turned what should have been a really celebratory time after winning their first trophy at the end of last season and qualifying for the Champions League. It's turned that into a really poisonous transfer period. It's embarrassing for them because they've not been able to get any players over the line because they can't offer the money that would secure those players, because PSR has got their hands tied because they won't let Isak go. And it's just ridiculous.
And there's lads probably looking at it going, well, I don't want to go there because they'll completely clip me wings and they won't allow me to grow or move on and have the career that I want to have. So like, it just makes you look like you've got your house in terrible order and like it's a terrible culture to work in, which I'm sure there's great aspects to it, but overwhelmingly as a player you'd be going, nah, I'm all right, I don't want to be the next one of him.
And there's people like me sat around on podcasts like this who are pointing their fingers going, is everyone really aware of what's going on at that club and who owns that club and all that type of stuff, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of what they're trying to do. By having the ownership of that football club and being in football, it's creating those entrenched views because journalists on one side are putting out spinning things a certain way. They as a club and what they're trying to achieve within their club, they could do without all of this. By the way, and I just think they need to get over that. It all feels a little bit childish, but whilst football is set up in a way contractually with footballers that there's no agency available to them once they're locked into a contract, then I think it's going to be a repeating pattern.
Yeah, and it all operates a little bit in the shadows as well, doesn't it, Andy? Because you sort of look at the situation at Nottingham Forest this summer, for example, and again, sort of weird ownership structures, the way we look at weird ownership structures. Like, I didn't think about Marinakis for 1 minute, really, besides a couple of strange on-pitch incidents last season, where I thought about his level of ownership, and now that Forest have put out some frankly just bizarre statements over the summer, particularly in reference to the Morgan Gibbs-White situation. It seemed like Gibbs-White wanted to leave, to go to Tottenham. Forest blocked that and then suddenly signed the new contract, and Marinakis is being hailed as the hero for that, and that sort of doesn't sit right with me because, sort of moving on to the club side, as Stu mentioned before, it's the clubs and people like Marinakis who do have all the power. So suddenly player decides, well, actually, do you know what? I'm happy to not make that move to Tottenham. I'll stay at Nottingham Forest, who have been, a great sort of development piece for me, and I'll give more service because I love this club and I love these fans. And then suddenly we're turning around and going, oh, it's the owner who's the hero there. That will never ever sit right with me, I don't think.
No, we should never revere billionaires to that level, really. And it sort of saddened my heart a little bit when I was watching Crystal Palace against Nottingham Forest on Saturday. Or on Sunday, sorry, and Palace have this tifo of Marinakis is front and centre, and the Nottingham Forest fans in return are singing Marinakis' name. It's like, what? like really?
Yeah.
Like, is this one of these things where as I'm sort of getting older and everything that my dad used to complain about, and I just rolled my eyes at him, I starting to like complain about these things, games gone, etc. But I just thought, for God's sake, is this what we're doing now? And this is ultimately driven by the egos of these owners. Marinakis stood there next to Morgan Gibbs-White as if he's got him hostage while he's doing this interview to make sure he doesn't say the wrong thing. Like, you do realise it's not live and editing exists. You didn't need to be right there and make it so obvious. But, this is ultimately the reason PSR is in place. It's been widely criticised. It's in the early stages of its, I suppose, implementation, and it will be tweaked because clubs outside the top six will say it's stopping us being ambitious and getting to where we need to. I would argue it just means you have to do it organically and grow like Liverpool had to do. Liverpool, FSG didn't buy the club and we didn't go straight to sort of winning everything. We had to work our way up. We had to sell players at different points, and you sell Coutinho, you get Alisson and Van Dijk, you grow and get that little bit better. And ultimately, that's what Newcastle are going to have to do. It's going to have to sell Isak, strengthen the squad in 4 different positions. The camaraderie and the team spirit's all a lot better. That's what Eddie Howe's all about. And then you go for it, but no, they want to go straight to the top straight away, and that's what can't happen. And what it mitigates against is situations like Aston Villa, where right now the wages to turnover ratio is 91%. Now, like, I'm no economist by any stretch of the imagination, but I do know if there's one way to put yourself out of business, is to have a ridiculously high wages to turnover ratio. And from my perspective, what they've done is they've thrown everything at getting into the Champions League last year. They've thrown the kitchen sink at it. It's not happened, and now they're in big trouble. And this is why they're having to sell academy product after academy product after academy product. But the issue is, if it does go badly wrong and these egotistical owners just sort of wash their hands of it and leave, well, they don't care what the state of the football club ends up in. And that means that ordinary people lose jobs. It means, there's kids on the street instead of playing football for their local team. It has a massive knock-on effect on communities, on supporters, and on ordinary working people. And those billionaire owners don't care about that, and they never will. So there does need to be regulation against these maniacs to stop them destroying literal communities, not only football clubs.
Yeah, and that's where I think we as fans are always going to have less sympathy for these clubs who get into these scenarios, really, Emilia, because like I'd sort of, I had a bit of sympathy for Tyrone Mings and John McGinn in their statements, because ultimately they're not in control of the books at Aston Villa, so they can't help the fact that Aston Villa have had to sell this really talented local lad in order to meet PSR. But Andy mentions it there. That's just a poorly run football club. We can all see that. We can see that back from the days when Gerrard was manager, and their transfer approach was just scattergun. It seems to me that even though Emery's been a little bit more careful in the transfer market, they're still sort of cleaning up from that and cleaning up from a few of these failed transfers that have even happened during Emery's time. So I almost, you don't know what to say really, because there's so much smoke and mirrors around football, and there's such a knowledge gap for us as fans. Like Andy references the finances that I don't ever remember seeing as a kid. Not that I would have engaged with it as a kid either, but you're definitely seeing that more come into play now that we're in this social media world and things. But even still, we don't get to see the chats that ownership have with players. We don't get to see the promises that are made to players. We mentioned about the players before. We don't get to see what they sort of say behind the scenes. So ultimately it leads me to think, well, as Stu said before, the clubs have the ultimate power. I don't really have any sympathy, because they're the ones who hold the purse strings, and they've spent willy-nilly, which means ultimately end up in sort of sadder situations like this.
Completely. And I think if you're trying to decide kind of where your sympathies or your loyalty, or just kind of, I don't know, like your time of day is going to go, I'm far more inclined to give it to an individual who may have been painted to seem like they've been egotistical or difficult, or perhaps that story's been shaped in a way they've had no control over, compared to a business or billionaires or an organisation that has so much more at their disposal. And I know it's easy to say kind of like these players are on incredible salaries, they're doing a dream job, this and that, but compared to the organisations that they're sometimes going into battle with, they are relatively powerless, and they have a very short time span in which to try and achieve whatever they're seeking to achieve.
Yeah, and one injury could flip it all as well.
And then at which point they say, thanks for that, see ya, like you're worth nothing to them anymore. And that's, I think, where the selfishness comes down to it. I'm okay with an individual being selfish to pursue their dream, their goals, to do the best they possibly can with the talent they've got, for the family that they want to support, like for everything that they've dreamed of their entire life and worked hard for. It's hard to have any degree of sympathy or loyalty to a business. And I then see the club as separate to that, because the way we feel about the club is more as like a concept, as like what it means to us all. It's not the business, the billionaires, the people behind it, not Liverpool necessarily, but any club that you're talking about. the way you feel about it is a bit more like, is esoteric the right word? Do you know, like, it's more of a feeling than it is like a structure, a business, like an organisation. And that's why I think if you've got the choice with who to side with, I'd always choose the person that's involved. But then I don't know if, like, from a HR point of view, do you think Newcastle with Alexander Isak have until recently thought, maybe there's a way back from this? Like, because we've had really good players recently who've been tempted to leave and we've managed to bring them back into the fold and they've had intentions to go elsewhere and we've made it work. Like, do you think until it went nuclear, they've been thinking this might not be a point of no return yet? Maybe we're able to manage this situation. I don't know.
Yeah. Stu, is there a scenario in which we feel any sort of sympathy for the clubs? I'm almost trying to think of it, putting my Liverpool hat back on now and trying to think of scenarios where I maybe have had some sympathy for the club. Emilia referenced the Trent scenario before. I think why Trent is so much different for me is because it felt like Trent's words and his actions didn't marry up. Like all the things that Trent said over so many years about, you know, dreams of captaining Liverpool, about preferring Barcelona to Real Madrid and all these kinds of things, for him to then turn around and say, well, my dream is actually to play for Real Madrid. Those two things don't marry up. So that's where I'm inclined to have less sympathy for the player and more sympathy for the clubs. But, you know, you look at it and a lot of these clubs are, you know, loyal to players in the way they develop them. We mentioned injuries there. There are scenarios where, and Liverpool, I would argue, have been good at this in recent years, albeit I'm always going to look at it from a sort of biased point of view and through rose-tinted lenses. Liverpool have been quite loyal to injured players down the years and helped them stay around and get their careers back on track and things like that. So is there any scenario in which you can sort of look at it and be like, actually, the players acted the goat there, and I do have a bit of sympathy towards the clubs?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely can feel some sympathy in terms of clubs only behave in a way, and players only behave in which the landscape allows them to be able to do it. Okay, so yes, I don't think, as I was saying before, I don't think it's set up in a way that's fit for purpose to for both sides, so everyone knows where they're at. I don't think everyone knows where they're at, and I think there's all the smoke and mirrors, and there's, you know, an agent says this, or this is released, or this is briefed, and this is all because the landscape around it is not fit for purpose. And by the way, I don't have the answers to this. I sound like, you know, I'm like trying to like offer some kind of guidance. I am not an employment lawyer. I have no idea, but there's got to be a better way. Yeah. And in terms of like the players and what they come up with, you've mentioned the Trent scenario there. Listen, in all walks of life, these are human beings. And in all walks of life, there's divvies, there's sound people who sometimes are divvies, there's divvies who are sometimes sound, and generally that's pretty much all of us really, isn't it? You know, like, you know, everyone's, and people have over time as well the right to
1,
change.
2, 3 and 4.
But you know, players as well, you know, these are young people. They come through, we first get to see sight of them at, you know, 17, 18, 19, or in the case of Rio and Gamoa, 16. They're more than entitled to change their views as we see them grow up. And we see them not only grow up and maybe have different views in life, but also they grow up in a footballing landscape where they do convert from fan to employee. And the difference between us as fans, we can have our hearts broken by a football club, by a team or by a player, but it's from a removed distance, not directly impacting us. The things that go wrong for players or football clubs directly impacts them. And their wage, or the politics within the dressing room, or they can be put out by something that's being said by a manager or by someone higher up within the club. They can be mistreated. We've seen countless examples over the years of young players being mistreated at clubs, and older players for that matter of fact. Everything is more personal to them, and we never get to see that. We never get to see all the little political machinations behind the scenes at clubs. We just have no idea, and of course they go on. You know, you find out after the fact that if you find out after the fact there's been a bit of argy-bargy on the training ground, two players have had a fight, then it's quickly, you know, said by other pundits, it goes on all the time. Yeah. Well, we don't have a clue. Yeah. We don't have a clue. Do we think the players don't fall out with coaches? They fall out with them all the time as well. There's constant fallouts. We've all got our workplaces. We've all got our, historically, in places that we work, we'll have had our own beef. At places, there'll be times where we've had our nose put out in joints and we've thought, you know. And so that it's all so different, isn't it, to what we actually feel indirectly as fans and how we romanticize everything. So I definitely think you can feel sympathy for players, but I also think institutionally you can feel some level of sympathy for clubs and the people who are trying to run those clubs, the ones who are trying to run it in the right way, I suppose, whose hands sometimes will feel tied behind their back, or a lot of the time feel tied behind their back, and they're reduced to having to do off-the-record briefings to try and get some kind of level of control over what the real message is. And as I said, and I mean that from both the player and the club side.
Yeah, and that's where I guess to sort of segue into that more focused fan side, Andy, you know, I guess it does depend how much of the behind the scenes we see, because with Trent it felt like we saw none of the behind the scenes really. There was no discussion about what happened with the contracts in the end, whether, you know, one was offered by Liverpool at the right time for Trent, or whether it was offered at the wrong time for Trent, because, you know, if more came out to that regard, that Liverpool were late or lowballed Trent with an offer, you'd maybe be inclined to have more sympathy. But really all we saw play out was just this, it seemed like it was just this desire from Trent to leave, and everything that came out from Romano was suggesting that Trent had his heart set on this, and he's come out since in his press conference and said that. So that almost the idea that Liverpool stayed so silent on this throughout and just sort of left it on the player to sort of sully his reputation, it does almost make you think a little bit about the Isak scenario on the flip side of it, because it seems like everything that's been briefed this summer really has not come from Isak's side at all. It's come entirely from the club side, and finally Isak's got his say, so they almost feel like sort of juxtaposed views really.
Yeah, and I suppose it depends on what relationships the player or the player's agents has with the journalists. So for example, you see like Fabrizio Romano not only breaking transfer news now, but any time, like, to use a horrible extreme example, he's trying to wash the image of Mason Greenwood. Anytime Mason Greenwood scores a goal from Marseille, Fabrizio Romano's tweeting, you know, he's done this. So that's an extreme example, you know, which is obviously morally horrible. But there's situations like that all the time where he's tweeting, you know, Lamine Yamal scored this, this is the players who have relationships with him. So some players will be good at that, some players won't. Some players' agents is literally their DA. Some players' agents are like career agents who do this for a living, you know. So that'll be the difference, I think. You know, with the Trent side of things, and you know, there's no need to be morally consistent in something as trivial as football, really. Like,
I'm glad you said it, because when Stu was being really reasonable, I thought, oh, fucking hell, am I a dick?
Yeah, which of those categories did you fall into? Really?
I love what Isak's doing now, but if he doesn't do us in 3 years' time, I'll be raging. And Newcastle fans are absolutely right to be raging and be absolutely fine with what Wiss is doing. You know, it's football. It's not, you know, this isn't, you know, being paid to ask questions in Parliament. It is literally just, it is.
Makes hypocrites of us all.
And it's absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine. It's literally a game. You know what I mean? It means so much to us all, but it's literally a game. But obviously, the thing with the Trent thing, as you know, put so eloquently when it came out, was you can't have your cake and eat it. You've made yourself out to be this, you know, you've made your brand out to be the loyalty to the supporters, and now you're saying, well, I'm just an employee and I want to do this and I want a new challenge. So no problem with that, but don't bluff that you had this sort of thing in the past. So yeah, every player is different, every agent's different, every agent's relationship with the journalist is different, and some players will be able to wash their image quite easily because of the relationships they had. Some will struggle to get their stories out, and I suppose that's just the spice of life, different personalities.
And I wonder in that sense, Emilia, if there's a world in which we can have any sympathy with Newcastle fans for the way things have played out with Isak this summer. I think it's been hard because of the Newcastle fans with social media presence have made it hard to love them in any way really, or to respect their views really in any meaningful way. But I guess that, you know, to an extent there is a bit of a thing where, you know, Andy mentioned it, football making us hypocrites. I was quite frankly fuming with Philip Coutinho when he did everything he did, when he was, you know, faking his back injury, and Philip Coutinho had no real loyalty to Liverpool. He was a player who Liverpool bought for, I think, circa £10 million, developed into world-class talent, and then he wanted his move to what was a bigger and better opportunity at the time to go and play with Lionel Messi at Barcelona. And there is a time where you can almost not begrudge that as fans, but then again, as Andy mentions, like, we don't have to have that moral consistency, and I'm sort of, I guess I'm tossing and turning with the Isak thing where I'm a bit like, I do kind of feel sorry for the Newcastle fans, but I just wish they stopped being bellends.
Yeah, no, because you're right that if in 3 years' time he did the same thing to us, I'd be at the training ground booing him. I'd be there with my kid going, boo him as the car goes past. He's a traitor.
Boo this man.
Yeah, because I guess that's the point, is like, you've got businesses, you've got individuals that work within it, but as fans, we are entirely emotional. Like, you don't have to be rational. I'm not having to make business decisions. I'm not having to balance the books. I'm not having to be the HR manager. I'm not having to write the contracts. I'm just there to feel the feelings and to fall in love with these lads for what they do for Liverpool, and to have my heart broken or to feel completely betrayed if they then let me down or leave me. So I genuinely do have every sympathy with them. I've got no sympathy with the club Newcastle and the way they've handled it. But as a fan, I can completely understand. I get why they're booing us when we tip up because you're going. It's like having to see the other woman that your fella wants to leave you for and be like, sound, great, fantastic, have a happy life together. Like, I hope you're both miserable. I completely get it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm going to try and sell Stu on your idea, and I'm going to try and make it less reasonable. Stu, the final question, you're going to have the final say on this. Is it fair for us to hold higher expectations for local lads? Because, you know, we've referenced the Coutinho scenario there, we've referenced the Isak scenario. I think one of the sort of the strong reasons that we as Liverpool fans have come up for to defend Isak to an extent is that, you know, Andy mentioned he might have signed a 6-year contract, but he may have had promises to leave 3 years into that to move on to a bigger and better opportunity, which is what presents itself in Liverpool now. But with someone like Trent Alexander-Arnold, with Steven Gerrard, with all that happened with the Chelsea move and different scenarios like that we've seen play out, I guess Ross Barkley from Everton, Tom Davies from Everton even, are we right to have, you know, different expectations for local lads, or is there again, like, do we have to try and sort of be a bit reasonable in this?
I think that there's the two very different questions, aren't they? Because in terms of are we right? Probably not. But should we be reasonable, and are we going to be reasonable? Absolutely not. No. You know what I mean? But over these types of things, because
I think I've won, by the way.
Yeah, definitely. Because in this situation, when you're talking about a local player who's a lot of the time, Trent is an example, but he's not the only example. A lot of the time, the local boy come good who plays for his favourite football team is marketed, is put out there by himself and by his branding team, as well as the club, as someone who is wedded to the club, a boy who's living out his dreams and yada, 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 yada. And in the situation with Trent, I think we almost need to separate it from Liverpool of a different time. So if Liverpool 10, 15 years ago had that same situation with Trent, I think you'd like to think, but it's probably not true, that there'd be a little bit more understanding of Liverpool are not in a position to be able to fulfil his dreams and career aspirations. But Liverpool now are an absolute global powerhouse. You know, the pick of the transfer market this summer could have gone anywhere, Verts, and he chooses Liverpool. Liverpool have got the ambition, they've got the money, and I think that's probably the thing that we feel most rejected by. Why are you leaving? Why are you wanting out at this point? And also, I think the fact of we're always going to be, well, you're just one of us. You're just a lad from down the road, and you know, But there was too much of a void, of an absence of comment. I think you mentioned something before that Liverpool stitched Trent up by not saying anything through that whole final year. I think Liverpool did him a great service. I think Liverpool were incredibly kind by keeping their own counsel and giving him the send-off that they did. I don't think for a moment that they lowballed him, but I also don't think that they were going to compete with a free contract offer with a huge signing on fee that brings from Real Madrid. They weren't going to be mugs. But Liverpool would have looked after that lad. Yeah. But he made a personal decision, which, as I said before, he's got every right to do. I don't have to like it, but I do have to accept it that it's his right. I'm not going to be reasonable about it. He's burnt his bridges with me, never coming back. I'm not interested at all. But at the same time, I'm allowed to feel that way. But what I'm not allowed is to dictate that lad cannot go anywhere. He can make that choice. All right, hope it works out for you. Let's see how that goes, lad. But I'm entitled to go, you know, you finish with me. We're done. The thing what Newcastle have done here, just to go back to what your, I really loved your metaphor of the breakup.
Thanks.
And having to see that and feeling sorry for those fans. I think as much as Newcastle fans will inevitably be blaming Isak and they'll be blaming Liverpool because we've been seen to have unsettled him, they should also be blaming their ownership because ultimately their owners, by the stance that they've taken, have dragged this out so that they're having to see and hear about the gossip, if you like, about their former spouse and their new partner every day for the past 3-4 months, whereas they could have just done it, got on with it, and then brought a new player in, have a new spouse, and be excited about that shiny new, potential. So, but they're not in that situation. So until the band-aid is ripped off, until the signature is on the divorce, Newcastle are having to cop for it, and that is not Liverpool's fault, and it's certainly not just Isak's fault either.
Yeah, well, a great metaphor from Emilia. We finally run Stu right over, and I'm just figuring out Andy's divvy to sound formation as well. So a successful show all in all, I think. I'm not sure if we got any further behind the scenes of what goes on at these football clubs around these transfer sagas, but we will keep discussing big talking points like these. Nice one to everybody in the room here, particularly the lads behind the camera doing the sound as well, and the pictures of the Reds.